So hello and welcome to another episode of Art of Science. My name is Graham Ambrose, an assistant professor at North Carolina State University, and your host here on the Art of Science podcast, which is a quarterly interview podcast that coincides with each issue of the Policy Studies Journal. And a reminder up front, as always, to rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. So with that, I'm happy to introduce the four co-authors that we have with us today. First, we have Adam Wiechman, a postdoctoral researcher associate at Princeton University, and will soon be assistant professor at the Wagner School of Public Service at NYU. Thank you for being here, Adam. We have Elizabeth Koebele, an associate professor in political science at the University of Nevada, Reno. We have Margaret Garcia, an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment at Arizona State University. And we have Marty Anderies, a professor in the School of Human Evolution and Social Change, as well as the School of Sustainability, also at the Arizona State University. And the main issue of PSJ, our authors here co-authored a paper entitled The Inclusion Trade-off, comparing the design and functionality of collaborative governance forums. At a high level, the authors focus on inclusion criteria in environmental forums, leveraging ecology of games, public choice, and collaborative governance theories, and trying to go beyond the traditional arguments of cost benefits as they associate with expanding inclusion in these types of forums. They specifically examine participants' perceptions, institutional design choices regarding inclusion and management concerns, and they leverage both surveys and semi-structured interviews in 4 water user associations in the state of Arizona and the United States. And they find very broadly that the breadth of inclusion at the forum is associated with internal or external spillovers in benefits. So with that, again, just thank all of you for being with us today. And would one of you want to just start off by digging in a little bit deeper to the publication?
Sure. Thanks, Graham, for having us. It's a pleasure to be on a podcast that I myself am also a listener for. As you said, we were trying to unpack the inclusion trade-off in not just environmental governance, but as we talk about in the paper, something that's been talked about much broadly in political science and political economy generally, going back to designing the right voter rules, perhaps in an electoral system. And one thing that motivated this paper was what I was reading was a ongoing call to understand how specific variations in inclusion criteria change the functionality that participants experience within a forum, with the idea being that participant experiences are a good indicator of forum function more broadly, because if the participants aren't experiencing the benefit, there's probably a short lifespan on that forum. Like you said, we wanted to break this down in the state of Arizona, where I was doing my PhD and learning a lot about water issues in that area that I did other work on during my time at Arizona State. And what we found is in these 4 water user associations that had different levels of inclusion criteria, and by that we mean who gets to be a part of the forum or who can be a member, that there were different benefits that were provided by different levels of inclusion. And we broke it down by first whether there was sector specific inclusion criteria. So can you only be a municipal provider, for example, to join? And rights restrictive was the second category. So in Arizona, like in other parts of the West, water rights are very precious and associated with certain surface water sources, like say the Colorado River is the big one in the news these days. there was one forum that we looked at that required users to have certain water rights to join. So that also changed who could join. And as you said, we had these two kind of spillovers that we found related to the internal spillover that's associated with having stricter inclusion criteria all the way up to the rights restrictive level, where there was a positive feedback that emerged where similar types of users were joining who had similar objectives and similar capacities, and so they could contribute more freely to the common cause, and having stable contributions and a shared mission ends up spilling over internally to other functionalities like advocacy, research, information sharing, because kind of everyone's on board with the mission. And everyone can contribute because these water user associations require membership fees, for example. And the external spillover that we traced in this work pertained to the other end of the spectrum, the more inclusive forums. And this one is probably not new necessarily to folks coming out of ecology of games and thinking about spillovers, but in the more inclusive forums that were both sector and rights inclusive, there was more of a tendency to see the region that they operated in as collaborative, or as cooperative, I should say. And while we didn't ask about this in the survey, we could trace the story behind this through the interviews that we did, that folks were having more interactions with more diverse users, and so they began to see that kind of we all share these common water sources, and had a more favorable evaluation of their regional cooperative context. So yeah, those are kind of the two big sources of feedback that we trace in that paper, but happy to get into much more detail as the conversation progresses today.
For sure. And thank you so much for just going over that. And I guess one thing when I was reading the paper that I would love to know a little bit more from you guys on is inclusion. And you talk about this really well, I think, is this big kind of squishy thing that it's talked about in a lot of different ways. It's very important in a lot of different ways. Can you just talk about your approach to thinking about inclusion in all of the ways and all the facets that it's talked about, and kind of pulling it down into what you ultimately kind of wrangled with in this paper?
I guess I can get the conversation going, and then I'm sure my co-authors will have other things to contribute. But as someone who does a lot of modeling in other parts of their research, I'm very keen on the subject of trade-offs. But I'm also someone who got a PhD in sustainability and listened to a lot of people talk about the benefits of inclusion. And more broadly, because this is coming out of like research movements dedicated towards participatory governance, and also kind of starting my PhD during the kind of DEI wave more broadly. I'm in academia, and so inclusion was on my mind a lot in grad school. But as someone who thinks a lot about trade-offs and enjoyed reading the polycentric governance, ecology of games, et cetera, literatures, I was always kind of attuned to this worry about transaction costs that are associated with adding more objectives, perspectives, et cetera, to a decision-making process, and how one of the most important things that a forum or decision-making process in general can do is make decisions. And so if the transaction costs get to be too high, potentially the ability to make decisions in general can decrease. But again, these are kind of general things that I'm talking about. And so we wanted to kind of sink our teeth into a real case to break down what are the the benefits to adding more perspectives, more users to particular forums in a salient policy topic in the state of Arizona, which is water. And one of the things that I'll say before pass it over to Elizabeth, I saw she just unmuted, is that we wanted to add in the consideration of management concerns in this paper as an important caveat that I think gets brought up all the time in environmental governance, that there are no panaceas and that institutional designs have to make sense to the social ecological context. And so just as we asked folks about their perceived functionality of the forum, we also wanted to ask about management concerns that were salient to forum participants, and not just what they were concerned about, but whether they thought collaboration was necessary to address that management concern, because perhaps not everything that you care about requires you to go to a meeting every month or quarter or year or whatever and talk to people to resolve it, to put that in context. Yeah, but I'll let Elizabeth take over.
Awesome. Adam, you're doing a great job explaining this, and I'm happy to just add some thoughts, but you're nailing exactly, I think, a lot of the things I was thinking about behind this paper too. And both you and Graham have sort of spoken to this idea that we know that there's literature that says, okay, there are trade-offs with including more people in forums. But as someone who's studied collaborative governance for a long time, I think a lot of literature and even a lot of kind of practice still just sort of has this implicit assumption that like more inclusion is better, and that does sound like a good thing on its face, right? Like it sounds more democratic. We want to include more voices. I think, doing that, we see benefits like making sure all of the right perspectives are represented. People have opportunities to learn from each other. You can garner more resources. Like for a long time, this was a lot of the stuff that I thought about when I was studying collaborative processes. But as you mentioned, there are these drawbacks, right? And so not being able to make a decision in a decision-making forum is a pretty big drawback, right? But we also see, these forums potentially get mired in conflict and, perhaps not even achieve some of their core initial goals that they were set out to, or, created or designed to sort of achieve. And then we also, I think a really important kind of newer idea in the collaborative governance literature is that more inclusion isn't always necessarily democratic, because the folks who are included aren't elected or representative, right? So we also have to start thinking about kind of those concerns about designing a forum and who actually has access and what that means for the legitimacy of the decision-making forum and those sorts of questions. So for me, like all of that literature was sort of circling around in my head when Adam was working on this. And I think it's really cool to look at how these different criteria can create different outcomes, because if we want to design a forum to produce different outcomes, the more we know about sort of what inputs lead to what outputs, the better we can design that forum, right? Like not all collaborative forums have the same goal. And I think this is something we're like just starting to do a better job distinguishing in the literature about collaboration and about participation and things like that. And maybe we sort of underemphasize that there really is a diversity of collaborative institutional designs or collaborative institutions that have different goals, right? Like if you want to work really closely with a bunch of people to lobby on behalf of some common interest, your forum probably looks pretty different than if you're in this broad kind of information sharing space where maybe you're developing a regional management plan and you need more diverse voices. So I think, Adam, you touched on a lot of this, but I think for me, those are some of kind of the theoretical ideas that might resonate with PSJ readers that sort of drove how we thought about inclusion in this paper.
I'm curious too. So as I'm listening to this, I think I'm hearing kind of two aspects, and I would love to know more about how you guys have thought through this and balanced it, that there's kind of a lot of theory that has grown, particularly over the last 10, 15, 20 years around collaborative governance. But there seems to be also just an experiential component of, having been to enough forums and having talked to enough people, realizing what is out there and what practitioners and individuals are actually doing. And I hear people kind of talking about this implicitly, but I'm curious if you could also talk about kind of where that balance is and if that has also spurred the questions associated with this paper.
Could you clarify real quickly? Are you asking about kind of just what the role of experience is in your perceptions about forum functionality, or was there something more that I missed?
Yeah, I think in part, we can look to theory and try to find the gaps in the theory or the questions that are still left to be answered. But the other side, and what other people have talked about on this podcast, is getting to know the communities and going out and talking to folks and seeing what they're experiencing that is just fundamentally different than theory. And I'm just curious if you guys can talk through that, because I'm hearing it in the background, but I would love for kind of a more direct conversation of those balances between those kind of two parts of where question asking comes from, if you will.
Yeah, no, it's a good one, and I think it's one that I definitely had to wrestle with a lot during my PhD, because as someone who was doing a PhD it's in sustainability, and at a university like ASU, which prides itself in kind of use-inspired research, where we want to do research that kind of also produces some sort of social value. I wanted the research to be driven also by issues of concern to the population that I was studying, which was water users in Arizona. And by water users, what I mean mostly are large water providers. I'm not talking about like my apartment complex in Tempe, but with that, we originally had done a interview study a couple years before, that was just focused on the Phoenix metro area, because I was just trying to understand the context that I was operating within. I was producing an urban water systems model for particular cities, but I was quickly starting to realize that these cities talk to each other. So how exactly does that work? After that interview study, which was very explorative, where like we were doing a lot of snowball sampling and just tracing who's talking to whom in the Phoenix metro area, I started to learn more about these water user associations that then kind of grew into the project that we're talking about today. And before we even set the question for this study, I had multiple conversations with water user association leaders, where I just sat down with them and asked about the kind of issues that were coming up in the association, and what they even thought was something that was interesting to know more about. And one thing that I became attuned to over the course of those conversations is that in general, as I think people outside of Arizona even understand, is that the region's growing a lot. And as the region is growing a lot, there are new water users that are popping up, that maybe were not large water users in the past. And so there's an active question that can be asked about whether these new water users need to be kind of included into the fold of the existing governance structure. That was kind of what led me to ask these questions about whether inclusion should be expanded or contracted. It was interesting that we added questions about those changes to the survey as well, and use water user association feedback throughout. The last thing I'll mention about experience is that not all water user associations started in the same year. We note in the paper that some users are more established than others. Some started in the 60s versus the newest one was like 2007. And experience obviously is a major contributor to the success or failure of a collaborative governance forum, and that's what makes the cross-sectional survey research design so difficult when you're just asking people how are things going at this one point in time, which is why we felt it was necessary to couple it with those interviews that we did before. To understand what the story was for the more structured survey results that we were getting.
I think getting to know those water users associations and sort of the different roles they play in the regional governance context was really interesting. So I'm the non-ASU author on this paper, but I actually grew up in Phoenix, and a long time ago I did my undergrad at ASU, and grew up in a town that gets water from the oldest water provider in our study, one of the providers in the oldest water users association. And so for me, it was really interesting. I think growing up, that even inspired a lot of my work on the Colorado River system, thinking about this. But, it's very established. There are a lot of older municipalities outside of the Phoenix area, whether that's Scottsdale, or I grew up in Mesa, Arizona, or Gilbert. And there's a lot of infrastructure and, just a lot of kind of shared governance and a lot of high governance capacity in those areas. And then there are some of these other areas of the state that are pretty different, like Southern Arizona. There's a much more diverse, sorry, I don't know if that was me. I'm not sure if someone else has unmuted, sorry. But there's a much more sort of like diverse group of water users, right? Some are doing more drawing from groundwater than surface water. We have larger agricultural users that are participating in this water users association. And then we have, this whole kind of area in what we call the West Valley, west of Phoenix, that is an area that, at least from the Colorado River world that I work in, is an area that a lot of people are really concerned about. There's a lot of growth going on without necessarily a lot of assurance of water supply in that area. So what does a water users association look like in that sort of area as there are these new players coming into the system or into the governance context, like Adam was mentioning? So I do think, it was really interesting to sort of get to know the different kind of flavors of these water users associations, and really help that kind of, or really use that to help kind of unpack why they do have different goals. And I think, even though we're talking about water users associations here and water provision, I think that we learned some kind of more generalizable lessons too, that, could potentially work for other sort of collaborative groups by categorizing them in these ways, like, how old they are, what the diversity is of the sectors that participate, like those sorts of kind of criteria we see across lots of issues, not just water. So I just wanted to add that in. But Margaret, I think you also unmuted. Please jump in.
Yeah, I was trying to jump in. So I think as the engineer here, I'm a water resources engineer by training, I think it's also important to point out that the municipalities across these water users organizations are also really diverse in their water supply portfolios, the infrastructure that they own, their relationships with large water providers like Central Arizona Project CAP, that conveys the water from the Colorado, as well as the Salt River Project, or SRP, that provides water from the Salt and Verde rivers. And because their portfolios are so different, they're really differentially vulnerable to different flavors of water challenges, all of which we have. So we have groundwater overdraft challenges in some parts of the state, and the majority of these urban areas are in places where that groundwater is regulated, but some of them are not fully integrated in to that system, in that they have these kind of temporary water supply certificates rather than a long-term designation of assured water supply. So they're in this, they're kind of half in the formal process. And that makes them more vulnerable as conditions change. And we also have users that are heavily dependent on the Colorado, which is, of course, in a very tenuous position, particularly Arizona's position within the Colorado River is the most vulnerable at the moment, and others that that have relatively low vulnerability. And so this heterogeneity can be a major challenge in trying to coordinate and decide, what do we advocate, what do we invest in? And that's where I think these inclusion criteria really were useful for this particular group of entities. The other thing I wanted to note is, I think the other thing that got me interested in this is just that experience of working with municipal water utilities in Arizona on other things and bumping into their roles on one or more of these water user organizations. And the or more I thought was particularly interesting, where utilities are in some cases members of the oldest and most robust water user organization of AMWA, but also have membership in a newer forum. And seeing some of the ways that information traveled beyond a single water user association via those entities that had shared membership. So that was something interesting that I think we just bumped into empirically doing other work.
That's great. And I think this is so cool to just hear kind of where all of this is coming from and kind of the experiences, not verse, but against the theories that we learn in class, that we read about in papers. But that kind of leads me to my next question. How did you go through that reconciliation of seeing this complexity, and particularly Western water rights are beyond complex? Without knowing much about it, I'll say they scare me away. They're so complex, right? But how do you then look at that through a theory, or how did you solidify what theories to kind of look at that complexity through? And was there kind of reconciliation that you had to go through that process to kind of root the paper that you ultimately put together?
Sure. So I guess I'll start us off again. Like I said, this survey work started first as a more exploratory interview project a couple years prior that I did with Sarah Alonso Vicario, who was another PhD student with me in Margaret's lab. She is also an engineer. And we were interested in tracing the complexity of Phoenix surface water provision, not just on the social side, but as an engineer, she was also interested in the source water and infrastructure conveyance as well. And I know Marty hasn't jumped in yet, but as one of the originators of the coupled infrastructure systems framework, and as his student, I had that tool in mind as I was going about the tracing process. So I think I remember in like the summer of 2022, or maybe it was 2021 when we were doing the initial tracing work, I just had this gigantic spaghetti plot in like a Miro board somewhere of all the different infrastructure systems and people and natural water sources that were involved at multiple different levels, down from like an individual city in Phoenix all the way up to like the Colorado River Basin. Through the course of that spaghetti plot drawing, I think I quickly started to come face to face with the dragon of complexity, I guess, that is most resource provision problems anymore. With that, that's when we started to realize this recurring theme in our interviews of the role that AMWA was playing as kind of a central coordinator and information provider, facilitator of conversations among at least the 10 major cities that participate in AMWA in the Phoenix metro area, and other forums at the state and regional level, kind of representing the municipal voice. And I say municipal in quotation marks, of course, because it's only 10 cities that they represent. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are saying things that other cities would disagree with or other users would disagree with. In fact, one of the things that came out of our interviews with other water user associations is that sometimes they like to use what AMWA puts out as their own, to kind of free ride in a way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that what they're saying is something that other folks disagree with. But anyways, we realized AMWA had this central role, and so we decided to dive in there because as we mentioned, I think in this paper and the previous paper, a lot of studies of polycentric governance or ecology games that we were building off of like to take like a larger systems view, and you do your big kind of exponential random graph model on your big network to draw your inferences on what produced kind of that structural configuration. And we were very interested in diving into kind of the meso level at the forum level of what was driving decisions that were made for this particular forum structure, and how does that particular forum structure then affect the people who participate within it. And what I mean by meso is like micro would be like the individual people, so individual organization kind of system or region. But yeah, love to hear what the co-authors say.
If I may jump in now, I'm just curious, Adam, you and Sarah were in a dynamical systems course about that time, and we're thinking about how you would even begin to develop a formal model of the process of decision-making and governance in these large water infrastructure systems. Do you think that had any role to play? And I mention that because my entree into this research, my interest has always been from this robustness angle. And like 13 years ago, my colleague and Margaret Jansen and I published a paper in PSJ, something along the lines of the robustness of social ecological systems, implications for public policy. And we were thinking about these iterative decision-making processes that generate, that guide systems towards particular outcomes. And of course, in the robustness literature, the key elements are modularity, diversity, and redundancy. And it's not hard to imagine how that comes into how these different forums operate. And I'm just curious, Adam, if that had any impact on the framing of what you were thinking about at the time.
I think I took that class in 2022 or 2023. So it was definitely after we did the interviews. And it feels like a century ago. I don't think that shaped our choice to focus on AMWA. But I think that the dynamical systems focus class definitely affected the way in which we were situated the dynamic decisions that cities have to make kind of within that broader network, because the model that I developed during my PhD that I think Marty may be referring to was focused on individual cities and how they make decisions. But one of the drivers behind this project was, like, as I said a few minutes ago, I quickly recognized that these decisions are not made in isolation, and in fact, cities are frequently consulting one another about what they think and what they're doing. And so perhaps maybe as a preview, I'll say that I'm taking what Marty said to now think about modeling polycentric decision making more broadly as part of the postdoc. So just now, Marty.
And I think maybe in the first paper too, one of the things we realized is like yes, there's this big polycentric system and there are these actors within it. And if we use some of the approaches like ergoms, or like we were using kind of a network approach in our first paper, we're often sort of missing like the intentional institutional design that goes into these collaborative forms, right? Like we might be able to like, put a little covariate that, okay, this actor belongs to this collaborative form. Let's figure that into the model somehow. But I think like one of the things that sort of inspired this second paper and came out was that historical management concerns, these historical decisions, legal rights, like all of these sorts of things sort of build together. I think for a while we were using like the terminology like co-evolve, right? Like an institution co-evolves with its management concerns. And I think that this paper helps highlight that, the importance of recognizing that when we study polycentric systems. And I would say like that's one of the things that made me really interested in this work. I'm really interested in how we can design collaborative forms that solve coordination problems in polycentric systems, right? Because that's like one thing we always point to as what can lead a polycentric system to, I don't want to say fail or not achieve its desired goals, right? So how do we sort of like address that coordination problem? And I think the intentional design of forms that recognize things like, okay, what are the characteristics of the resource you're managing, those sorts of things, can help solve those coordination problems if done well. So yeah, trying to provide insight into that sort of thing too, speaking to improving broader polycentric governance by thinking, more carefully maybe than we have in the past about the role of these individual forms and the design of these individual forms for system level outcomes too. And we're not necessarily measuring system level outcomes in this paper, right? We're focusing on kind of like the characteristics of forms, but I think that that was a motivator and a neat outcome to think about with this study too.
Great. And to change just a little bit here, but I know we've touched on a lot of this already, as Adam and you all have been talking about kind of the trajectory of kind of your work together, and Adam, your own dissertation. But I am curious if you have any advice for young scholars about building research ideas and projects, starting from those kind of first nuggets, might they be in class, and how does it become this kind of now string of papers that you guys have done together? Do you have any advice for young scholars?
I'll try to keep mine shorter since I know I've got less experience than the other folks in the room. But perhaps maybe my joke response would be to find a good group of mentors that you parachute in on for their NSF project. Which was my strategy, I guess, in grad school, where Marty, Margaret, and Elizabeth here, and also Aaron and George aren't on the call, but they had a great NSF project together studying urban water transitions, and their kind of model, I think, of interdisciplinary collaboration was a great model for me to follow throughout grad school. So that would be my first joking piece of advice, is to find a good team that you parachute it on. But the real advice I guess that I would give is, I think one of my favorite memories of early grad school was when I went to the first Copper conference, the policy process conference, and I sat in on a journal, or maybe it wasn't a journal roundtable. It was the last roundtable that was the experienced folks from the policy process world. And Brian Jones's piece of advice was that you need to find something that makes you mad. And while that sounds negative, I think the way to interpret that more is find something that makes you passionate, or that makes you frustrated, I guess, on the world. Perhaps our emotions are indicators of things that are misplaced in the world that need to be solved. And I know for me that big thing has always been decision making in infrastructure systems, because as someone who had an engineering background, I was always frustrated by the optimal solution and the pursuit of the optimal, because I could never see someone pursuing the optimal in the real world where decisions are being made. And that's what kind of led me to the urban water research that I was doing. And then you kind of follow the breadcrumbs from there of understanding how cities make decisions and et cetera. So find something you're mad about and follow the breadcrumbs, I guess, would be the two things. And then the last thing I'll say is to embrace kind of your local context and realize that you don't always have to look far to find good cases for what you're interested in. When I was applying to grad school, I was convinced I was going to do work in Ecuador because that was a case that I got really passionate about before grad school, with the water councils there being kind of a great example of self-government. And the pandemic happened. And of course, I found the Great Urban Water Transitions Project that I parachuted on, and realized that there were a lot of amazing cases in my backyard. And so that would be what I say.
I can add that, yeah, if you don't have a good team to parachute in on, you try to build it yourself, and find people that have complementary skill sets that you can learn from and then learn with, is my advice. And then I also would second what Adam said about, look for the problems in your backyard. As a water resources engineer, everywhere has some kind of challenge with water. Whether it's, water quality or flooding or scarcity or cost, figuring out how to maintain the system in a cost-effective manner. And there's a lot of interesting stories to be told that the people who have those stories to tell sometimes don't have that many people asking. And I think we saw that particularly with the conversations we had with small water utilities, where for some of the smaller cities, we were the first person that asked them to tell their perspective, at least, in quite a while. And there's a lot to learn from just how it's working, what's not. And that can kind of point you in the direction of some of those interestingly kind of frustrating puzzles.
I just wanted to pick up on a point both Margaret and Adam made about being a little bit agnostic about the system you're working on. The issue with finding things that make you mad is they accumulate as you get older, so watch out for that one. But as a theoretician, I mean, most PSJ readers are sort of at least tangentially ostromologists at heart. And the basic machinery and the tools and the ideas from institutional analysis apply everywhere. And maybe this is a little bit of an overstatement, but those kinds of problems that the Bloomington School outlines are everywhere. And I think it's important to see those problems everywhere you look, as opposed to focusing on a particular sector or a particular issue, particular kind of natural resource. And it kind of opens up more avenues for intellectual flexibility to really recognize collective action problems, governance problems, institutional analysis problems with the provision of shared infrastructure everywhere you look. Can be overwhelming at times, but it opens up lots of research ideas.
And I'll just throw in a last little comment of echoing a lot of what's already been said about, finding or building a great research team. I always like to think back to the fact that Margaret and I started what was the seeds of this urban water grant that Adam then worked on. Over 10 years ago when we were grad students, we had a small grant through the NSF Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center at the time, so SYNC, and started, I think one of the things that made the biggest impression on me from that time is we sort of tried to come up with what we were calling boundary objects that we could all use and sort of understand and speak to. And we looked to the IAD framework a lot at that time. And our colleague Erin DeLotte was doing a lot of work in that and sort of brought that to the group. And, now we've worked with Marty a lot, who has so much expertise in that. And I think, I look back and I'm like, we all kind of learned enough about what each other does through this sort of common object to like be a little dangerous. Like, I'm never going to understand all of the everything behind the engineering work or the modeling work in this project. But I think that a huge benefit I've had just from working with these, really smart and diverse scholars over time is like, it does help me see problems in a slightly different way, because I at least kind of understand some of these different drivers from different disciplines. And I think when we're working on policy problems and governance problems, being able to at least have kind of a foundational understanding of the resource and the system and the infrastructure and some of these other things really was important for having more, impactful outcomes, being able to ask better questions, like coming up with the interview guide. I think about how important it was to really understand the system. We couldn't have just gone in sort of understanding only the governance context, but knowing about how infrastructure was interconnected between cities and why there were certain pressures in certain areas on different types of water resources. Like all of those things were so important. So, and I think for me, at least, that really came out of working with an interdisciplinary team and working together over a really long period of time on these kind of questions too. And so it's neat that our team kind of continues to grow, and, we get to add more people and see people like Adam take these kind of cool new directions that, fit under the bigger umbrella, but still all sort of have the same roots.
And a similar question, but just a slightly different angle. Looking back, is there advice that you would give a younger version of yourself? And is there anything that specifically like spurred that change that the advice would have given?
I feel like this is something I don't have to start with, so I'll let one of the other co-authors start.
How younger?
As young as you want.
40 years ago, I would have.
Yeah, up to you.
Yeah, but maybe best to have younger folks start with this one.
So Adam is too young and Marty is too old, so it has to be us, I guess. So one thing I'll say is I came into graduate school in an interdisciplinary program, kind of similar to Adam, with like an interest in a lot of things. And something that took me a little while to figure out like how to do was to like figure out like where was my place in those things. And in a way that's, iterative, and I keep refining that, but to move away from I have to be able to understand all this myself or grapple with it all myself, to I need to learn these things and connect with others that can bring in these other pieces, I think was just a really important pivot for me that happened in grad school. So I would say it's great to be excited in the whole about many different aspects of the system, whatever system it is you're working on. I also had my PhD advisor always encouraged me to ask bigger and bigger questions. At first I asked like 2 small questions according to him, and he wasn't satisfied until I was asking at least 10-year questions, which was great but daunting, and then took me I was asking questions that were then so big that I couldn't answer them in 10 years, but I needed to, find other people to work with. And that's not a bad thing, but don't try to take those all on your own. Try to find the people that you can, and the community that you can work with towards those questions together.
Was there any experience that kind of turned that lever, or moving from the trying to do it yourself to finding a group?
I don't think it was like a flip of a switch. I think it was kind of a gradual process. But where that really got operationalized was what Elizabeth mentioned, was meeting a couple of other graduate students at a workshop and then, keeping in touch with them. And then about a year later, writing a proposal together and it happening to be successful. And that was the flip from, I think, learning that was a good idea to figuring out like how to actually start to operationalize it. And sometimes that kind of comes ready-made with your PhD environment, and sometimes it does not.
Sure.
Maybe this is indicative of the fact that Margaret and I talk to each other a lot, but I feel very similarly. I think, finding the place in these bigger research teams and projects where you can focus and you can bring expertise that it might help you dive deeper into one question. So I remember like Adam came to me with all these questions about forms and collaborative governance. And at that time, I was already sort of thinking about how collaboration and polycentric systems work together. And so we were able to do like a real cool deep dive in our literature review for the first paper. And I was like, okay, this is like, maybe this isn't the system that I work in. And maybe this gets to Marty's point, like being a little agnostic about the system. Like I hadn't worked on water users associations in Arizona before. I kind of do more meta governance stuff for the most part. And, but seeing how, okay, I could bring this piece of literature, this area of literature that I'm an expert in to help try to answer some of these questions. Like to me, that's the most fun part of research, trying to figure out how to like kind of take a question and operationalize it and bring together the right literature and stuff like that. So I do think as an interdisciplinary scholar, it can be tempting to try to like learn a little bit about everything. And I think for a while I was going for like the mile wide, inch deep sort of strategy, for better or worse. I think finding that kind of like specific area of expertise that you can bring to these projects is definitely something important to reinforce to people. And maybe that this is my like meta takeaway that I've been thinking about during this conversation, but it's sort of like our like polycentric systems, right? Like we need coordination to make this effective, and not every actor can do everything. And, so we're our own little polycentric system in this group trying to do effective research.
If I'll just add one point. If I could rewrite history from the previous century, I would like to have had a sense early on in my academic career of the difference between frameworks theory and models. And I never came to appreciate that till I had the honor and pleasure of meeting and working with Lynn Ostrom for a decade, how to think about these problems, because it's very easy to get trapped in particular theory or particular models and not really be able to navigate. On the other hand, as Elizabeth just said, you have to be careful not to be mile wide and inch deep. But this notion of framework theory model and moving seamlessly between those two, I think is a really important set of skills to have. And if I could rewrite history, I would have, I started my PhD in 1993. I didn't meet Lynn till 2001 or something like that. Man, if I could have those 8 years back and have met her in 1993, that would have been great. But now that she's so well known, everybody can meet her in the literature and have those skills.
I will say I read one of her papers that delineated that very nicely when I was a PhD student. One of my committee members said, this is a good one to read. And, even being, further from that not being my core, it was still really helpful to get that distinction.
Now it's in week 3 of my policy process theory class that I teach at UNR. And sometimes my students are like, why are we talking about this? What does this matter? It's all jargony. But I think, this maybe helps reinforce that it does help us think through problems in different ways and sort of scale up and scale down the types of questions we're trying to ask and answer.
Okay, Adam, are you closing out this section? You started most of them. Are you closing?
I'll keep it short. Unlike my other answers, that I think the most important thing I would tell myself is patience. I think like a lot of early career folks in general, like you feel the fire underneath you of what you need to be doing all the time, and it's hard to, I guess, scale those expectations down to even like the minute level of what progress needs to be seen, or where projects need to be. But perhaps we need some more patience and trust in the process.
Great. Well, before I ask everyone for their last thoughts here, I just want to thank you all again for joining me for an hour to talk about your paper, but more importantly, talk about kind of all those hidden background things that really drive research, but it seems like nobody talks about out in the open. So again, thank you for just your candor and openness of talking through those things. Before closing out, any kind of last thoughts from you all on advice or the paper or anything in between?
I did a little reflecting on this question when I saw some of the interview thoughts beforehand, and we haven't talked about this particular part of the paper yet, so I'm sort of circling back to some of like the more technical-y stuff. But I think like for me, the big takeaway was that there's no silver bullet for designing collaborative governance processes. And what really emphasized this to me is Adam did something really creative and asked kind of a hypothetical question about like, would restrictive groups change their inclusion criteria? Would inclusive groups make their criteria more restrictive? And like the two big established long-term groups who one's really restrictive and one's really inclusive, they both said no, right? Like they thought that their different designs worked for their needs. And to me, that was like a really cool finding of this paper, right? Like they were recognizing, I mean, and some of that is maybe like path dependency and, you know, all of those other things, but I think they were recognizing that like they've sort of shifted how they work to achieve the kind of goals that they need to achieve, right? So is it more kind of like a goal of internal cohesion among high capacity cities? Is it more of a goal of regional collaboration because you have really interconnected water sources and uses in other places? And I think, you know, it's important to sort of think about collaborative processes not in terms of some sort of like absolute level of like success that a design can help us achieve, but more like a success relative to your management concerns, your context, those sorts of things. So for me, that was just something I wanted to throw in there at the end because we hadn't really talked about that part of the survey. And I think I know I was skeptical about how it would go at first, and then it produced some of the kind of most interesting findings to me. So yeah.
I think along those lines, the other interesting thing I would point out that maybe we should have highlighted a little bit more in the discussion is that institutional capacity is something that is often used as a covariate or confounder of the collaborative process. And I think that what our study speaks to is that institutional capacity is something that can result from the process. That's what we were kind of getting at with that internal spillover argument, is that the institutional design can itself augment the capacity of the participants, and then of course echo what Elizabeth said about the classic no panaceas argument, that I think Marty even wrote a paper about that too. But yeah, it's the last thing I'll say is that this has been a great team to work with throughout this process, and hopefully other folks will find valuable interdisciplinary opportunities in the complex environmental governance problems that we will still be grappling with going forward.
Great. Any other last thoughts? Well, I just want to thank each of you, Adam, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Marty, for being here today. Again, I'm just thankful for taking the time to talk to me, but also to talk to our listeners. And again, if you are listening, just a reminder to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast here. And additionally, follow us on Art of Science Podcast on Twitter and Blue Sky. Again, thank you both to Policy Studies Journal and the Center of Policy Design and Governance at Syracuse University, who support this podcast as a joint initiative. So again, thanks for our authors and thank you listeners, and we'll see you next quarter.
Thanks, Graham. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.